This video is about the difference between evolution and adaptation. For our purposes, evolution refers to the change in a population over time. That makes it very difficult to observe these small changes that might happen over long periods of time, or even dramatic changes that happen in a relatively short period of time. For evolution to happen, though, there needs to be passing on genes. Genes are going to be things that determine traits or behaviors. Adaptation, in contrast, is going to be a trait or behavior that improves life in the current environment. So I'm going to give you a few examples so you can kind of see some of the differences between adaptation and evolution. So here we have a wolf, and through selective breeding, humans have domesticated dogs and now bred dogs for all these traits. All right, so this is an example of change that's happening over time. Here's a Hawaiian honeycreeper. You'll notice that the beak fits into this oddly curved flower. The two work well together. That's a great example of an adaptation. So it's something that's improving the life of this bird because it's able to get the nectar from this flower. All right, so here we're seeing this moth changing over time to be either the orange colored moth or more the white and brown color. But that's an example of evolution. Here's a great adaptation. This Arctic fox is camouflaged in the snow. It's able to survive better because of that camouflage. Here's a bird. The beak's gradually changing over time. That's a great example of evolution. When we use the word evolution, we just mean change over time. Macroevolution is the idea that the changes are big, like macro, they're big. So you're going from a single-celled organism sometime in the distant past to a population that we now see today. Microevolution is describing changes within a population. These are observable. We can see these. So some examples of a microevolution might be explained by things like natural selection. Now, typically, evolution is described in these terms. Macroevolution is described in these terms. Random mutations plus natural selection plus time. But there's a lot of difficult things to explain that way. So perhaps a better explanation would be, rather than random mutation, think of it as adaptive mutations plus natural selection plus time. So what's the difference? Well, randomness can't be tested scientifically, but whenever living things are put under pressure to survive, they adapt. And often this is a matter of turning on some sequence of DNA or genes that allow, or sharing of DNA, but it's deliberate things organisms do in response to their environment. Some of those are going to be positive changes. The negative are weeded out through natural selection. Add to that some time, and it's a slightly better explanation for some of the changes that we see over time. So this is how macroevolution is depicted, starting at one small single-celled organism, branching out over time into the complex things that we see today. These are some of the major avenues that are used to support this theory of evolution, macroevolution. So things like the fossil record, things like anatomical structures, how you might see that same anatomical structure in multiple animals, similarities in molecules like DNA sequences, and the study of embryology are all things that are sometimes used to support the theory of macroevolution. Microevolution, we can observe. We can see some of these changes. Like we can see the effect of a mutation or gene flow or how non-random mating affects a population. In the case of this peacock, the bigger, the brighter the colors, the more likely they're going to pass on that trait. So that's not random mating. Genetic drift, where a few members of a population start a new colony on an island, let's say. And so the whole population takes on the traits of those original founders. Or in the case of natural selection, certain traits are beneficial and help that organism survive and reproduce. Other things are selected against, so they don't get to survive and reproduce and pass their genes on. The beneficial genes get passed on. The ones that have no benefit aren't passed on. That's the idea of natural selection. So adaptations are going to be traits or behaviors that improve life. So for example, here's a polar bear. You can see some of the adaptations that this polar bear have in order to survive better in its Arctic environment. Caribou, there's some adaptations for this caribou. Things about the caribou that help it survive in its environment. For camels living in a desert, they have certain adaptations that help them have a better life or existence in their desert environment. An owl in its environment has some adaptations. For example, it can see at night, or it has large talons. It has the ability to glide quietly up on its prey. So these are adaptations that help that owl survive and be successful in this environment. Sometimes those adaptations are behavioral, sometimes they're structural. Behavioral adaptations means like habits that organism has or possesses. Structural adaptations are physical things like hair or the length of the horns or the ability to smell or the feet. Some of the things we were looking at were mostly structural adaptations. So here's 3 examples. Pick one of them in your mind and just think to yourself, what are some adaptations that help that organism survive and do well in its current environment?